Clearwater Valley, Montana Territory. October, 1878. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning against the deep blue of the autumn sky. Down in the valley, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and curing hay, a smell of frantic preparation. Every cabin had a man on its roof, checking shingles, or on its walls, forcing fresh daubing into the gaps between logs. Every man but one. Carl Vogel was splitting wood, his axe strokes echoing with a steady, unhurried rhythm. It was his wife Annalise, who was tending to their cabin's walls, and she was doing something no one had ever seen. She wasn't chinking the outside, she was plastering the inside. With a mixture that looked like little more than dark, gritty mud, she worked by the light of a single lantern, smoothing the strange paste over the rough-hewn pine logs. It wasn't just clay and sand. Mixed in were buckets of fine gray wood ash, scavenged from every fire pit in the settlement, and coarse horsehair that gave the slurry a fibrous, sinewy texture. Ewan McLeod, a man who had raised over 30 structures in the territory and whose hands were maps of splinters and calluses, stopped on his way from the trading post. He leaned on the half-finished fence, his expression a knot of confusion and professional offense. "Annalise," he called out, his voice a low burr of Scottish certainty. "What in God's name are you doing to that cabin? A log wall needs to breathe. You seal it up like a tomb, and you'll have rot in the heartwood come spring." Annalise didn't stop her work. She simply pressed a trowelful of the dark mixture into a seam, her movements fluid and practiced. She looked over her shoulder, her face smudged with gray. "It will not rot, Ewan," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the rhythmic thud of her husband's axe. "It will breathe, just not from the inside." McLeod shook his head, a deep sigh of pity escaping his lips. He saw a woman committing a foolish, fundamental error. He saw a fine cabin, built with Carl's strong back, being ruined by strange old-world notions. But Annalise Vogel wasn't building a tomb. She was building a thermos. And when the great blizzard of '78 hit, a winter that would be spoken of for a century, the difference between breathing from the inside and breathing from the outside would be measured in a single, staggering number, 68 degrees. If you want to discover the lost arts of frontier survival and see how simple physics could mean the difference between life and death, subscribe to our channel. We uncover one forgotten technique every week, proving that the old ways were often the smartest ways. The mockery did not take long to ferment. Annalise Vogel was an outsider, a woman from the dense, ancient forests of southern Germany. Her ways were not the ways of the American frontier, which valued speed, practicality, and proven methods. Her father had not been a logger or a carpenter. He had been a Kachelofenbauer, a master craftsman of the massive, heat-retaining ceramic stoves that formed the warm heart of German farmhouses. She had grown up not with the axe, but with the trowel, learning the alchemy of clay, sand, and fire. She understood that warmth was a shy creature, easily startled and quick to flee. Her knowledge came from a different world, one where fuel was precious and winters were long and damp, not just brutally cold. This cross-pollination of knowledge, so often the seed of innovation, was seen in the Clearwater Valley as simple ignorance. The criticism began with Ewan McLeod's professional pronouncement, which spread through the small settlement like a grass fire. He was the experienced builder, the voice of authority. "I've seen logs sweat themselves rotten in a single season," he told the men gathered at the blacksmith's forge. "You need airflow. That's what chinking is for. It seals the big gaps, but lets the timber itself release the damp. What she's doing? It's like wrapping a wet man in an oilcloth. He won't feel the wind, but he'll be soaked in his own sweat." His logic was sound, based on decades of experience with conventional methods. It was a perfect example of a right answer to the wrong question. Then came the community voice, Silas Croft. A farmer with more opinions than acreage, Silas had a knack for coining a phrase. He'd watched Annalise and her children, 8-year-old Liesel and 6-year-old Jacob, hauling buckets of ash from the communal fire pits. "Look at them," he'd crowed at the general store, to the amusement of all present. "Building a house out of what's left over. Carl better be careful, or she'll plaster him to the wall, too." He gave her creation its mocking nickname, the Ash Palace. The name stuck. It was cruel in its dismissal, painting her methodical work as a child's fantasy, a dirty, primitive thing. The pressure fell most heavily on her husband. Carl was a good man, respected for his strength and his skill with a broadaxe. He had felled, hewn, and notched every log in their home with his own hands. The community's ridicule of his wife's work felt like a direct insult to his own. The family critic came in the form of his own brother-in-law, Thomas, who had ridden up from the next valley. He stood inside the half-plastered cabin, the air thick with the earthy smell of damp clay, and his face was a mask of pity. "Annalise, Carl," he said, directing his words more to his brother-in-law than his sister, "people are talking. They say you're building a cave, not a home." He gestured at the smooth, dark gray wall. "You know what this looks like? It looks like you don't trust your own work, Carl. Like the logs weren't fit proper, and now you have to cover them up with mud." That night, the weight of it finally settled in the small cabin. Carl sat at the table, running a whetstone over his axe head, the metallic rasp the only sound. "He is right," Carl said, not looking at her. "It is what they think, that my joinery is poor." Annalise came and placed her hand over his. Her own were chapped and stained from the plaster. "Your joinery is perfect," she said. "It is the wood itself that is the problem, not the logs. The idea of the logs." She paused, searching for the words. "In my father's workshop, the kiln had to be perfect. One small crack, and the heat would escape. The pottery would be ruined. He taught me that the enemy is not the cold. The enemy is the moving air. A house full of tiny, invisible cracks is like a kiln that can never reach temperature." "We are not hiding your work, Carl. We are protecting it." Her certainty was a fortress. She spoke of physics in the language of a craftsman. He looked from her determined face to his sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in the flickering lamplight. He nodded, a single sharp motion. "Finish the walls," he said. "We will show them." The final piece of official disapproval came from Mr. Davies, the land agent for the railroad, a man who represented institutional order. He arrived for a routine inspection, his ledger and pen in hand. He walked into the cabin and stopped dead. He tapped one of the now curing walls with a clean fingernail. It gave a solid, almost stone-like sound. "Mrs. Vogel," he began, his voice dry as dust. "The standard construction method for these land grants is clearly outlined. Log construction with oakum and lime mortar chinking. This interior sheathing is not in any manual I've seen." He made a note in his ledger. "I can't officially approve it. It's an unproven technique." The financial risk was now explicit. If the cabin failed, their claim on the 160 acres could be in jeopardy. They had spent nearly everything they had on tools, a wagon, a team of oxen, and the land fee. The cost of the plaster itself was negligible. Free clay from the riverbank, free ash from their neighbor's waste, but the cost of failure was now total. The mockery had lasted for a month. The validation, if it came, would have to last a lifetime. Annalise simply nodded at Mr. Davies. "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish," she said. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of fact. She trusted the clay. She did not trust the wind. The community saw mud and ash. Annalise saw a sophisticated composite material, an airtight membrane designed to defeat the primary mechanism of heat loss in a log structure: air infiltration. The problem wasn't conduction through the solid wood logs, which were nearly a foot thick. The problem was convection. The cold didn't seep through the walls. It was invited in through 1,000 imperceptible gaps, cracks, and pores. Her process was meticulous, a science learned at her father's side. First, the clay. She didn't use just any mud. She and the children dug it from a specific bend in the Clearwater River, where the current was slow and the deposits were free of stones and silt. They were looking for a clay with high plasticity, one that could be worked into a smooth paste and would shrink minimally as it dried. They tested it by rolling it into thin worms. If it could be bent into a small circle without cracking, it was good. They hauled nearly 800 pounds of it back to the cabin in wooden buckets. Next was the aggregate. Fine sand from the riverbank sifted through a burlap screen would give the plaster body and prevent the clay from cracking as it cured. This was standard practice. The revolutionary ingredient was the ash. It wasn't just filler. Annalise knew from her father's kiln building that fine wood ash, when mixed with clay and water, undergoes a slow chemical reaction. It's a pozzolanic reaction, the same principle behind Roman concrete. The silica and alumina in the ash react with the calcium hydroxide in the clay, forming stable, cement-like compounds. This made the plaster harder, more durable, and more water-resistant. But its most important property was particle size. The microscopic ash particles filled the voids between the larger clay and sand particles, creating a material with incredibly low air permeability. It was a 19th century version of modern air sealing technology. The final ingredient was the binder, horsehair, acquired from the blacksmith. The long, strong hairs acted as a natural fiber reinforcement, giving the plaster tensile strength, much like rebar in modern concrete. It would resist cracking if the cabin logs settled or shifted, which they inevitably would. The ratio was precise: 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part sifted ash, and a generous, hand-fluffed measure of horsehair. She mixed it in a large wooden trough with water, creating a thick, consistent paste. Applying it was the hardest part. The interior log surfaces were rough and uneven. She first forced a thick layer into the larger gaps between the logs, creating a solid, continuous surface. Then, she applied the main coat, about an inch thick, over everything from floor to ceiling. Her trowel moved with an inherited grace, smoothing the dark gray material into a seamless, monolithic skin that covered every log, every joint, every potential leak. The cabin from the inside no longer looked like it was made of logs. It looked as if it had been carved from a single piece of dark, soft stone. One evening, as she finished the final wall, Carl ran his hand over the damp, cool surface. "It feels solid," he said, "but Ewan says the logs will rot." Annalise picked up a small piece of leftover pine from the floor. "This is wood," she said, holding it out. "It is full of tiny tubes, like a bundle of drinking straws. When the wind blows on the outside of the house, it creates a pressure difference. It sucks the warm air from inside the house right through those tubes, right through the wood itself. Their chinking only seals the big gaps between the logs. The logs themselves still leak air from every inch of their surface." She then delivered the line that reframed the entire problem, the piece of physics made poetic that she had learned from a lifetime of managing heat. A house is not a fortress to keep the cold out. It is a vessel to hold the warmth in. We are not building walls. We are building the sides of the bowl. Her insight inverted the conventional understanding. They weren't fighting the cold. They were protecting the heat. The plaster did 2 things. First, its airtightness stopped the convective loop of air infiltration, the primary source of heat loss. Second, by being on the inside, it allowed the massive log walls to act as a thermal battery. The heat from the fireplace would warm the plaster and then slowly soak into the 12 inches of pine behind it. The logs would become a massive reservoir of warmth, protected from the exterior wind by their own bulk, and from interior heat loss by Annalise's airtight membrane. The house would not only hold its heat, it would store it. The plaster took 3 weeks to cure, the cabin filled with the slow, earthy smell of drying earth. Annalise kept a small, low fire going to manage the process, allowing the moisture to escape slowly. By the time the first hard frost of November arrived, the walls were a uniform, light gray and hard to the touch. The air inside felt different. It was still. Utterly, profoundly still. There were no phantom breezes on the back of the neck, no cold spots by the walls. The silence was deeper, the outside world more muted. The bowl was ready. Now they just had to wait for winter to try and empty it. Stay with me until the end, because the number that came out of this cabin, the difference between the temperature inside the ash palace and the killing cold outside, would fundamentally change how this entire valley built their homes for the next 50 years. The winter of 1878 arrived not as a gentle decline, but as an assault. It began with a blizzard in the second week of December that buried the Clearwater Valley under 4 feet of snow, isolating every homestead. But the snow was just the opening act. After the storm passed, the sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature plummeted. For 7 straight days, it never rose above zero, even in the midday sun. At night, it sank to levels that froze the sap in the trees, causing them to crack with reports as loud as rifle shots. The mercury in the settlement's official thermometer bottomed out at minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the crucible. The cold didn't care about tradition or mockery. It cared only about physics. Inside the Vogel cabin, a strange and wonderful normality reigned. A modest fire in the stone hearth kept the single room at a comfortable, even temperature. Annalise was teaching Liesel to read, their heads bent over a book at the small wooden table. Jacob was on the floor, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. They were all in their shirt sleeves. The air was so still that the flame of their single candle barely flickered. The warmth wasn't a blast from the fireplace that faded 10 feet away. It was an ambient condition of the room itself. The gray, plastered walls radiated a gentle, persistent heat, releasing the energy stored in the massive logs behind them. Carl had stacked a formidable cord of wood outside, but he was using it at less than half the rate of previous, milder winters. The bowl was holding its warmth. Now, if you appreciate this story of ingenuity and the quiet satisfaction of seeing skeptics proven wrong, take a moment to press the like button. It helps us share these forgotten histories with more people. The story was starkly different in the other cabins. The wind, though slight, was a relentless thief, pulling warmth out through 1,000 unsealed cracks. The cold was a physical presence. In Silas Croft's home, the community voice, the family was huddled around a roaring fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They had burned through 1/3 of their winter wood in just 5 days. The floor was icy, and a bucket of water left near the wall had a thick crust of ice on it. The mockery had frozen on Silas's lips. His was a battle of attrition, feeding the fire monster just to keep it from consuming them. The gut-punch detail of his desperation came on the 5th night. His wife began to weep silently, looking at the empty cradle in the corner, built for their firstborn who had passed the spring before. Silas, his face grim and set, took his axe, broke the cradle apart, and fed the hand-carved maple into the fire. He was burning memories to stay warm. For Ewan MacLeod, the experienced builder, it was a professional humiliation. His cabin, a model of tight joinery and conventional wisdom, was failing. He had chinked it himself that fall, yet he could feel the drafts everywhere. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, It was life-threatening. His wife was sick, her cough growing worse in the frigid air. They had retreated to a single corner of their cabin, hanging blankets to create a small tent around the fireplace. Still, the temperature inside struggled to reach 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He was a master builder whose masterpiece was being unmade by a cold he couldn't see, and a force he had misunderstood. On the seventh day, with his own woodpile shrinking to a dangerously low level and his wife's fever worsening, Ewan MacLeod surrendered. He bundled his wife in furs, put her on a sled, and made his way through the deep snow to the one place he had ridiculed. He walked toward the soft yellow glow of the ash palace. Annalise opened the door. The first thing that hit him wasn't the sight of the family in their shirt sleeves or the quiet domestic scene. It was the physical sensation of the air. It wasn't hot, it was warm, a deep, enveloping, and utterly still warmth. It was like stepping from January into a mild May afternoon. A cloud of dense, warm air billowed out around him into the frozen twilight. He helped his wife inside, and Annalise immediately settled her near the fire, giving her a warm broth. Ewan stood in the center of the room, stunned into silence. He looked at the smooth gray walls, the steady candle flame, the comfortable children. He held up his bare hand and could feel no drafts. None. He ran his hand along the wall. It wasn't cold like stone. It felt neutral, almost alive. He had brought his own pocket thermometer, a habit of his trade. He unpinned it from his coat. In the center of the room, away from the fire, it read 63 degrees Fahrenheit. He knew without looking that the temperature outside was now minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. A difference of 88 degrees. Annalise watched him, saying nothing. She picked up a single downy feather from a pillow. She held it out to him. "Try it by the wall," she said softly. He took the feather and held it near the seam where the wall met the floor, the place where a draft was always strongest. The feather hung perfectly still, as if painted on the air. It was the proof device, a simple, visual testament to the absolute stillness of the air. It was undeniable. Physics was the ultimate arbiter. Ewan MacLeod looked from the feather to Annalise. The experienced builder, the man of 30 cabins and unshakable certainties, slowly lowered his hand. He didn't make excuses. He didn't offer flowery apologies. His vindication was quieter, more profound. He stood in silence for a long moment, the warmth of her home, a deafening refutation of everything he thought he knew. Then he looked at the wall, then at her. "Show me how you mixed it." It was not just an admission, it was a request for knowledge. He had skipped acknowledging he was wrong and jumped straight to wanting to learn how she was right. It was the highest form of professional respect. The mockery was over. The education was about to begin. The thaw came 2 days later, but the psychological landscape of the Clearwater Valley had been permanently altered. The winter had been a relentless judge, and its verdict was written in the stark contrast between the Vogels' comfort and their neighbors' hardship. Ewan MacLeod, his wife recovering in the steady warmth of the Vogel cabin, became Annalise's first and most fervent student. The harshest critic had transformed into the strongest advocate. He did not just learn the recipe, he sought to understand the principle. He and Annalise stood by the riverbank as she showed him how to select the clay. He watched her sift the ash, explaining how the fine particles were the key. "It is not a wall, Ewan," she repeated. "It is a skin. It stops the wind from breathing through the house." He, in turn, translated her craft into the language of the frontier builder. "It's an inside-out chinking," he explained to a bewildered Silas Croft. "Seals every blessed pore of the wood." That spring, a new industry began in the valley. MacLeod, using his reputation as a builder, organized work parties. They didn't build new cabins. They retrofitted old ones. The ash palace was no longer a term of mockery. People started referring to the technique as the Plaster or the German seal. Families worked together, digging clay, gathering ash, and plastering the interiors of their own homes. Annalise, quiet and methodical, supervised the mixing, ensuring the ratios were correct. She never gloated, never once said, "I told you so." Her vindication was in the work itself, in the silent, spreading adoption of her idea. By the fall of 1879, 7 more cabins had been sealed. The following year, nearly every home in the valley had a smooth, gray interior. The results were immediate and dramatic. Fuel consumption across the settlement dropped by an estimated 40%. The cabins were not only warmer in the winter, but, as they discovered, cooler in the summer. The massive thermal mass of the insulated logs resisting the daytime heat. The innovation spread quietly, through practical decisions made by people who had endured a terrible winter and had seen a better way. It leapfrogged to neighboring valleys, carried by word of mouth from a cousin or a brother-in-law who had visited the Clearwater and felt the difference. Annalise Vogel's simple mixture of clay, sand, ash, and hair was a form of folk technology that anticipated modern building science by nearly a century. The concept of an interior air barrier, thermal mass, and the dangers of convective heat loss are now central tenets of energy-efficient construction. She had no scientific instruments, no heat flow equations. She had only an inherited tactile understanding of materials and a clear insight into the true nature of warmth. She saw the problem not as one of construction, but one of physics. The story of the Ash Palace became a local legend, a testament to the quiet immigrant woman who taught a valley how to be warm. Her children, Liesel and Jakob, grew up in a home that was a sanctuary, their childhood defined by a comfort their peers had never known. Annalise and Carl lived out their days on their homestead, their lives a testament to the power of questioning convention. They didn't see a flaw in their neighbor's craftsmanship. They saw a flaw in their neighbor's understanding of the invisible world of air and heat. The difference wasn't incremental, it was profound. The frontier was a harsh and unforgiving laboratory. It brutally punished what didn't work and richly rewarded what did. It didn't care about where an idea came from, only that it could stand against the judgment of a 30 below zero night. Annalise Vogel's legacy was not written in books or carved in stone. It was lived in, season after season, in the quiet, enduring warmth of the homes all around her. On the frontier, the best arguments were not spoken aloud. They were lived in through the silent, stubborn warmth of a single room. We hope this story changed how you think about the simple log cabin. If you have a story of old-world ingenuity from your own family or region, please share it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten engineering. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical building techniques. The characters and specific events are created for narrative purposes. The scientific principles of air sealing and thermal mass are real. Always consult with professional engineers and adhere to modern building codes for any construction project.